Welcome to the Old Man of the Three Things with JJ Redick and the Dunker Spot, Nekias, Duncan, and Steve Jones. Fellas, how we doing on this Monday morning?
Doing pretty well. Shout out to Fletcher Cox real quick. But doing well. How are you?
I'm good, man. I'm good. I'm still recovering. Had a trip to Phoenix. Got a podcast in on Friday. Had the game Saturday night. Took a very, very short red eye. I don't know how we call these things red eyes, where it's a 4-hour trip, and by the time you get up in the air and fall asleep, they wake you up 2 hours later and just a zombie all day. I had to coach Kai and Knox yesterday. Knox's team won the championship in our city league. Very excited about that. He played well in the championship. All right, let's get into this. So for today's show, I want to start the discussion. We're not naming all defensive teams today. We're starting the discussion. Still got a month left of the regular season. Not trying to piss anybody off today. We're going to talk about all defense. Throw some names out, throw some stats out, start the discussion. I want to talk about the Giannis Dame pick and roll pairing, and we're going to talk about Luka's historic run that he is on right now. So let's start with all defense. My first question to both of you. 10 spots here. Do we know if it's positionless or not? Are we sure?
I believe it is positionless.
Okay. Is all NBA positionless?
All NBA is positionless.
Yes.
Okay. I'm finding different things on the internet. I'm finding different things. That's why I ask. But it's good to know. All right. So all defense is positionless. 10 spots. Is there any players that as of today, March 11th, with a month to go in the regular season, you feel like to this point are locks to make an all defensive team? Doesn't have to be first team, just to make an all defensive team. Are there players that you feel are locks?
I think for me, Rudy Gobert is probably the most obvious / loudest lock for the team right now. He's probably your defensive player of the year leader. So I would imagine he's going to make a team. For me, I would have both of the, not going to name the whole team, obviously, but in terms of blocks, I think both the Celtics guards, Derek White and Drew Holiday, should be on. Herb Jones should be on. For me, Jalen Suggs should be on. That's probably where I stop with locks. And I have some strong favorites from there, but those are probably about 5 locks.
All right. Steve, what do you got?
I think I would agree with those locks. It's interesting. The question was, are we sure it's positionless? And I keep going to the games played minimum, because as the season progresses, more and more names just get knocked off. Like, it's just, even if you want to think about it, no Jimmy Butler. There's no OG Anunoby. There's no Draymond, no Evan Mobley. A lot of names just falling off. So I'm trying to do that in the calculus. As far as locks go, I think I would agree with Nekias' list. I think AD is a lock for me as well. I probably have Drew as well. And I'm leaning like Caruso as a lock for me. Just especially as the names start to whittle down. I had some question marks, Nekias, and I'm sure you had like a short list. And I wanted to throw a question to both of y'all, especially with all defense versus like defensive player of the year. Does it change like your criteria as far as how you evaluate them or how you think about their defensive season? Is there more wiggle room on the all defensive team compared to Depoy?
I think for me, like I feel like I'm starting to do a similar thing that I do with MVP / All NBA, to where like the impact / the winning weighs a little bit more heavily in MVP / Defensive Player of the Year. And with all defense, I kind of approach it as who is doing the best in their specific roles. Who's just getting after it? Like, I don't really care if you're the best on-ball defender in basketball. I don't care if you're on the Celtics or on the Wizards. Like, I just value what you're doing when it comes to all defense. You're not going to factor into Defensive Player of the Year if your team's getting blasted, defense is worse, even if it isn't your fault. But with all defense, like, I just want to recognize what you're doing. So, like, I personally view that a little bit more differently. I'm curious to hear what JJ has on that.
I'm with you 100% when it comes to the individual awards, MVP, Defensive Player of the Year. I'm not going to put the Defensive Player of the Year if your defense overall is 29th. I'm not. With MVP, you certainly have to factor in a million things. I don't think it, and historically it hasn't been the best player on the best team And it's not always the best defensive player on the best defensive team that wins MVP. I think Nekias is right. I think I would probably say Gobert is in that front runner position for defensive player of the year. With all NBA and all defensive team, I'm with Nekias on this too. And when you get down to like the last few spots, I did this last year. You're weighing certainly the games played. I did this last year. Games played, I decided on a minimum games played. Every voter did it a little differently. Now we have a minimum games threshold this year. But if there's a tiebreaker, I think then it's like, all right, the winning part certainly factors in, but the winning part factors in more for all NBA, and then the sort of overall team defense and where they are in defensive efficiency, all that stuff that plays a part in it. But I'm with Nekias on this because it's like, for me, a lock for me is Alex Caruso. Is like, I watch the Bulls play and I say, Alex Caruso should be on an all defensive team. Like he's that good and his impact game to game is that strong. The eye test does it for me with certain guys on defense. As a player, it's funny because I think we talked about this more internally. And now that everybody has a podcast, everybody kind of has a voice in this. It's like the players feel it. There were years where we would be like, how the fuck does this guy, like Drew Holiday for years was not making all defensive teams. And we were like, players started shouting it from a rooftop. Drew Holiday is one of, if not the best perimeter defender in the league. Like, and now we all see it. Now it's known. And like, he's been subsequently recognized. And I think he's there. I don't necessarily have Holiday as a lock this year. I think he's certainly in consideration. My sort of list was very similar to your guys. Gobert, Caruso, Derek White, Herb Jones, Jalen Suggs. And it's interesting because I think in a lot of these, defensive EPM stuff, what did I have earlier? Defensive box plus minus, defensive win shares. It certainly favors big men over guards. It favors big men over guards. And part of that is the defensive rebounding piece. But the other guy I would throw in there that I think is you have to give some consideration to, I say two guys, and that's Jared Allen and Shea, which leads me to someone you brought up and another player that I want to bring up. And that is, how do we sort of look at Anthony Davis, who the Lakers have been a middle of the pack defensive team all season, and Victor Wembanyama. That team has been earlier in the season one of the three worst defensive teams. I think they're 22nd or 23rd now. They're 23rd now. How do we sort of view them in this all defensive team scenario?
If I can go quickly, because you both, I think, had Anthony Davis closest to the lock list. I didn't have him as a lock. I didn't have Wemby as a lock. I do have
both words in my mouth, guys. I did not have Anthony Davis as a lock. I said I agreed with all your sentiments. That was Steve that had him as a lock.
That's closer to lock. You mentioned AD, I did not. But either way, like I had both of them making my team ultimately. So I don't really like the AD on-off stuff is interesting. And I think we talked about that in the prior episode, where teams are just blitzing the Lakers on corner threes with Anthony Davis on the floor. Like, I just don't think scheme-wise or conceptually that's his fault. And that seems to be, at least statistically, the biggest swing for why the defense is worse with AD on versus off. To your point, the eye test is just very loud with what Anthony Davis does. Like, the block stands out, but the amount of shots that he contests, the way he's able to execute multiple coverages when they ask him to, like, I just think he has been one of the best defenders in basketball. So I would still have him on. With Victor Wembanyama, it's funny, we talk about kind of how much the winning and stuff matters with Defensive Player of the Year versus all defense. And you look at some of the impact metrics with Wemby, in addition to he can just take away an entire half of the court because of his length. The Spurs defend like a top 10 defense when he's on the floor. And they are the worst defense in NBA history in terms of on-off when he's not on the floor. To have that impact that early on while he is still in the midst of cleaning up some footwork stuff and sorting through some foul trouble sometimes, like, it's incredible how good he's been. So, like, I think they've been good enough to make it.
I think the Wemby portion is interesting because in my head, there's a portion where I'm like, if your team is X, I don't know if I can really appreciate the defense you bring unless it's this loud, and his defense is this loud consistently. So for me, that's where he was on my list thinking about it. But, you mentioned like a Jared Allen. It's hard to compare sometimes because I don't feel like Jared Allen doesn't get some of the credit for what he does every single night, timing-wise, in pick and roll, protecting the rim, especially when it's him and Mobley together. Obviously, they've been in and out of the lineup, but he's so important to that team, and defense is so important to that team, so it kind of balances it out. With AD, I don't necessarily put all of the blame on him with some of the Lakers' struggles. I just think if he had been worse, would the Lakers be in this position? That's where my head goes to, okay, I think that's a little bit different. But like my mind goes to like Shea was a tough one because of the activity shown, the steals. But then it's like, okay, how do I balance that against Lou Dort? How do I balance that against Kentavious Caldwell-Pope? How do I balance that against some of these other names to where it's not a knock against Shea, but now he feels like he's competing against that pool of players. And I'm very interested, and I guess I would ask, because JJ mentioned it, how do you feel like it's going to be received with it being positionless? Do we think guards will get the respect for what they do defensively? Will it lean towards wings? Will what bigs do just end up being louder in certain areas and they end up getting some of the tiebreakers? Like that's always the fascinating part for me as we shift to that portion of it.
Right. It's a great question because night to night, right, the big is typically the anchor. He's the back line. He's not taking on the best matchup. Certainly, if you're guarding Sabonis or Jokic or Embiid or Anthony Davis, Wembanyama, even him, he's been guarded a lot by the four, essentially, a bigger wing. So night to night, the big guy, Jared Allen's not, going out there and trying to lock up Luka, right? But I would say the modern big, for the most part, is asked to do a lot more. So it will be interesting to see that. But I think you're right. I think in the eye test and certainly some of the statistics, it's like, how do you leave KCP off the all-defensive team this year? I'm glad you brought his name up because he was a guy that I was thinking about for this as well. I'm sure in Nekias' short list of 33 players, he was on that list. Am I wrong? Did you have a 33-player list for 10 spots?
33-player list, yes. But Kentavious Caldwell-Pope did make the list. A guy in a similar vein, Isaac Okoro, is another guy that I don't think he's going to make it, but he should be in very strong consideration. And I guess while we're in the shout-out portion, you brought up Shea. Nickeil Alexander-Walker has been one of the best guard defenders in basketball.
Facts.
Like, watch that dude navigate screens. Watch that dude help. Like, he has been elite on that end. And then you dig into some of the numbers with him as well. He's outpacing some of your faves in a lot of these. So I don't know where he ends up landing on that front. Like, that would require, folks to really dig in on everything Minnesota's doing defensively and not just kind of default to Rudy Gobert being the anchor, which he is. I don't want to discount that part. But Nickeil Alexander-Walker should factor heavily into this, in my opinion.
Okay, we're going to leave a lot of players off of this discussion. We are. It's just facts. We're not going to get through all 33. The one guy I want to bring up, we've named 13 guys so far for 10 spots. The one guy I want to bring up is Isaiah Hartenstein. I believe he deserves some heavy consideration for this. Think about how bad the Knicks defense was in December. That has completely shifted. They were incredible in January, number one defensive efficiency. I think it was actually under 100, which in today's NBA is insane. And OG Anunoby got a lot of credit for that, and rightfully so. But Hartenstein has anchored that defense post Mitchell Robinson injury. Some of the contesting stats at the rim, the stocks, the deflections, like, again, you watch the Knicks play and you're like, that guy is a fucking great defensive player. So I think he deserves some strong consideration. I'm going to give you each, that's 14 guys. I'm going to give you each one other guy that we should be thinking about for one of these teams.
Steve, you want to take this one first? I need to figure out which guy I want to shout out.
That's insane. Actually, you know what? While you figure that out, can I just bother you with the stat?
Yes. I love stats.
I have Herb Jones on my first team. Did you know Donovan Mitchell averages more stocks than Herb Jones?
Interesting.
Perfect. Got the reaction.
Perfect.
Awful.
Perfect. So Donovan Mitchell's your name for one other guy we should consider. Right? Not going to reach the threshold, it looks like.
Okay, well, I'm going to cheat a little bit. Assuming that we all agree that Bam Adebayo is really good at defense, I'm not going to waste my slot on Bam because we know he's good. I just want to quickly shout out Jabari Smith in Houston, who's had a really good defensive year, has been able to switch all over the place. He's quietly defended the fourth most ISOs in the league, allowing under 0.9 points per possession on those trips. He's been very important to an elite defense in Houston.
Yeah, I love that. I love that shout out. He has been really good. And if you look at the top 10 defensive teams, of course, we've talked about Minnesota guys. We've talked about Boston guys. We've talked about Cleveland. We've talked about OKC. We've talked about the Magic. We've talked about the Pels. Glad you mentioned the Rockets in there. They're 7th. Knicks are 8th. Heat is 9th. Denver's 10th. So we've covered someone from all of these teams. The other guy that's had a great defensive season that has flown under the radar is Jaylen Brown. Jaylen Brown has had a really good defensive season. He's been good in ISOs. He's been good defending the post when he's switched onto bigger defenders. He's been good in terms of the advanced stuff on contesting shots. Really solid defensive year from Jaylen Brown. All right, we've covered the initial discussion on March 11th. All right, let's get into the Lillard and Giannis pick and roll. They are starting to spam this action over and over again. Last night against the Clippers, this duo ran 29 on-ball screens versus the Clippers. Giannis himself ran 34 on-ball screens for 45 points. The 34 on-ball screens were the most in any game in Giannis's career. I think it's interesting because when this trade happened, this is sort of what we all imagined. It's like, yeah, you can run other stuff, but why not just run the Giannis Dame pick and roll? They had 38 points on those 29 on-ball screens last night against the Clippers. That is tied for the most points scored from any on-ball screen duo in a game this season. The Hallie-Turner duo versus the Bucks in the in-season tournament had 38 points. Guys, the other point I want to bring up on this, because we did cover the Bucks a little bit last week, I think given where they're at right now defensively and I would call it the organization on both ends of the floor, they're quickly, for me, moving into a different tier when I think about them as a championship contender.
I think for me, it's been a lot of fun to watch those two play off of each other and just to kind of bounce off of your pick and roll point. If we brought in the scope to just the two-man game, you said it was a season high against the Clippers in terms of on-ball picks. It was also a season high in dribble handoffs. If you combine those two, that's 38 just in pick and roll and dribble handoffs. And that's before even getting into some of the inverted stuff. They're just tapping into a little bit more as well. So Doc Rivers absolutely pulling from the James Harden, Joel Embiid playbook a bit. Like, these are our two best guys. Y'all generally don't have great answers for that. Let's clear aside and go to work. And I think just broader picture, I've just really enjoyed the way Milwaukee's been spacing the floor as of late. You see, even brought it out to Dame and Brook Lopez, the super high pick and rolls, and what's that's doing, what kind of space that's opening up for the Dame drives. Not just emptying a side with Dame and Giannis, but sometimes it's higher up on the floor. Sometimes this pick is being set inside the arc. So now Dame has a couple of dribbles to get into the paint, or it's an early pocket pass. And instead of Giannis catching it right at the three-point line and now driving into a wall, now it's one dribble spin, Giannis is at the rim, and you're in trouble. And so I think they're just finding the nuances there. And naturally, when you have those kind of contrasting skill sets, it's going to be tough to deal with. You don't want to switch that. You don't really want to blitz that. And I'm kind of with you. Like, I think they are firmly solidifying themselves as the second best team in the East. And that's been kind of up in question, despite the seeding that they've had this year. I think you should be afraid of the Milwaukee Bucks.
Ooh,
that's
strong.
That's going to be the thumbnail for this video. I'm going to tag that. You should be afraid of the Milwaukee Bucks. And then we're going to find somewhere a screenshot of Nekias making a really demonstrative face and put that in quotes. That's going to be the thumbnail for this video.
You got to point at the camera. And
should be afraid of the
nailed it. I think to bounce off y'all, the little things are improving timing wise, and you get the quote from Dame post game as far as how Doc sent them to the other end of the floor and just told them to go through reps and work together, and you're seeing the payoff of that. Just little things like Giannis getting to his spot and holding his screen for a beat longer, Dame being able to time up and understand when to come off of that. And now you can layer it. So as JJ mentioned, you're seeing the vision where Giannis screens, Dame is able to hit him on a pocket pass, he finishes. Now the weak side's thinking, okay, we have to help on Giannis's role because he's tough. Now that's an open three to Jay Crowder to bounce off your spacing point, Nekias. Now you can go empty side with those two. And they have the room to operate, and Dame can reject the pick and roll. Defense has to react. Now you're thinking we have to force Dame off the screen, and that's great, but you have two on the ball. Now Giannis is rolling. And it's just the layers for me that's important. The other part is it's not just the volume of them running it. It's that they're starting to now naturally get into it after the first option of something else. So let's say it's Pat Connaughton that screens for Giannis. Defense maybe handles that with a show and recover or a switch. Now Giannis is going into a dribble handoff with Dame on an empty side. And now it's becoming something to where it's not just you have to defend that action. It's tough. You don't know when it's going to come. You don't know where it's going to come on the floor. I think that's where you get to the overall flow of Milwaukee playing outside of the play more, understanding what they want to accomplish on offense more. And I think that with their lineups feeling more just in order, they just feel more bought into their process. There's more of an understanding of the why they are doing what they do versus we have talent, we should beat you.
A few things on that. Number one, you guys, I'm sure saw the Buck. You guys follow Bucks Film Room on Twitter? It's a great follow on Twitter. They had a short thread after the game showing Giannis on a roll, getting the pocket pass, Giannis on a roll, Euro steps on Harden, scores a layup. Next possession, Giannis on a roll. This time they help off the weak side corner. Jay Crowder gets a three. It's like there's no good answer because of Dame's shooting ability and his range. And you guys brought up the Harden Embiid partnership with Doc Rivers in Philly. I think what's interesting is like this is four very different players. And so when we think about like a Harden Embiid, it was that short roll to the elbow where Embiid got a lot of his points off of. Giannis is a roller and then I would call it a sprayer, if that makes sense. Like he sprays the ball out to the shooters. Embiid and Harden, both more methodical. Damian Lillard is not James Harden in terms of that ability to be methodical. He's going to come off. If that big is high up on the floor, he is as good as any guard in the NBA about attacking that, specifically going to his left hand. He's going to attack that, and he's going to get downhill and put pressure on the rim. There was a great clip last night. You guys brought up the DHO where Giannis had the ball on the left wing, and Dame in a full sprint, chases the ball, gets the dribble handoff, shoots a tough contested three on the left wing. That's not James Harden's game. To me, it's the pace that's different in this partnership. It's the pace. It's Dame coming off with pace. It's Giannis on the roll with pace. It's the passing. It's the next play. It's just a little bit quicker. And that is not a knock on Harden Embiid at all. But to me, visually, it's a little bit different. You still get great results, obviously. And then, the last thing I just wanted to bring up on the Bucks in general, because Steve brought up the lineup stuff. So if you sort of qualify 5-man lineups in the NBA this season, and you cut it off at, let's say, 250 minutes at this point in the season, that's a pretty decent sample size. There are 6 lineups that have a net rating of 10 or better, a positive 10 or better. 2 of those are the Bucks, which I find really fascinating. Obviously, the starting group with Middleton and Beasley, surrounded by Lopez and Antetokounmpo, that has a net rating of 15.3. And then creeping in there now, sub Middleton out and put Jay Crowder in there. Less minutes, that's at 266 minutes for the season. That lineup has a net rating of 21.9. And just so you know, those are the 2 best 5-man lineups that have played over 250 minutes together this season in the entire NBA. The next best lineup is the Denver Nuggets starting lineup, which has played the most minutes together in the NBA of any 5-man lineup. So the reason I bring that up, rotations shorten in the playoffs, minutes go up in the playoffs for the regular guys. So the Bucks are for real. Luka Doncic is on one right now. Had 39, 10, and 10 last night versus the Pistons. He's the first player to record 6 straight 30-point triple-doubles in NBA history. He also has 5 straight 35-point triple-doubles, which has also never been done before. The reason I want to talk about this is because I feel like Jason Gallagher feels like we don't give Luka enough love in the MVP conversation. And when I was thinking about it this morning, I thought of 2016, 2017, when Russ becomes the first player since Oscar Robertson to average a triple-double. Oklahoma City, which came into that year after losing Kevin Durant, not a ton of expectations. They end up winning 48 games and get the 6th seed in the West, and Russ wins the MVP. I think what's interesting about the whole discourse, specifically over the last 2 or 3 years about MVP, is everybody's like, oh, Tatum should get more love or so-and-so should get more love. I think what's hard is that over the last few years, we are seeing the very best, the guys that are getting first, second, third place votes. We're seeing them and their teams win at a high level, and they are having historical NBA seasons. So it's becoming harder to give just like real love to certain guys. And it's not to say Luka doesn't deserve love for MVP. He's certainly one of the best players in the NBA who's having an insane season. But when you factor in the fact that the Mavs just aren't a great basketball team, and by and large, they're winning because of him in some ways, it's hard to say, oh, you know, I've got him over Jokic, or I've got him over Shea, or I've got him over Giannis. I mean, these guys, again, they're having historical seasons again, and Embiid was having an historical season again, and their teams are winning at a higher level. Am I wrong in sort of how I'm thinking about that? Tell me if I am.
I'll go first because I don't think you're wrong. I think it's with every MVP debate, it becomes a version of hair splitting, and everyone has their different version of it. And I think it may become easier, even if he's even or above people statistically. If winning is a priority for you, how big is the gap for Luka? I think that's where it becomes difficult, because I looked up this morning, it's like last 10 games, he's almost averaging a 30, 35 plus point triple double. But I'm like, how many games did they win? But that's not necessarily his fault. So that's where I become stuck, because he is so important to that Dallas team. His offense and ability to beat any scheme you throw at him, whether you switch, you put 2 on the ball, you want to play drop, I think it gets tough. But I also wonder, is this just the time of year where defenses, especially as the schedule tightens up, do they just, and this is going to sound wild, are we going to live with this? Are we going to live with this switch? Are we going to live with this drop? And are we going to just live with that portion and try and take those guys away? And does that impact him? That's where I don't necessarily know in my head. I never say Luka isn't in it. I never say it's Luka's fault that Dallas is X. I don't necessarily go to the defensive end of the floor and go, well, he's not defending anyone, so he's out. I know some people might. But it just becomes, is it just by default, you are the easiest person in this debate to point something at? And so I'm just going to point at that and move on.
Okay.
Oh, that's an interesting point. Like, and just to quickly bounce off of that, I'm glad you brought up like are we willing to just live with this type coverage? Like, one of the things that I had in my notes as I was going through the Luka stretch, post All-Star break in particular, teams are blitzing around 9% of his pick and rolls post All-Star break. And that was nearly 16% before the break. And the switching is up. And so to your point, like maybe teams are like, he's going to cook anyway. And which, to quickly bounce off of that, only 16% of his shots are coming at the rim. A whole lot more mid-range jumpers coming from Luka. He has been on fire on those because he's just bullying anyone that switches on to him. But to that point, like, what does that do for him? What does that do for the actual bending of the defense? Like, I think that's worth pointing out. One thing that I've been in the headlock with in terms of Luka all year long is looking at how good he is, watching the Mavs lose games when he doesn't play, but then kind of zooming out to the overall, like on-off in particular, which isn't the end-all be-all. No one should argue that it is. But looking at the looking at the on-off stuff, and it's like, well, the Mavs are winning his minutes, but they're barely winning those minutes. Part of that is just the roster / lineup context, especially pre-trade. The bench is winning the minutes. Or at the very least, there isn't a massive drop-off like you see with Jokic, like you see with Shea. And like that has kind of closed post-All-Star break, that it feels like a more stark difference between when Luka's on, when Luka's on versus when he's off, which I think kind of helps the MVP case. But to your point, Steve, they're 4-5 in the last 9 games. And so if the winning gap becomes larger while the on-off split becomes larger, I don't know what that does for his MVP case.
Yeah.
And so I'm just trying to parse through like how much that portion matters.
Steve, he's actually averaging a 35-point triple-double over the last 24 games. Last 24, 36 a game, 10 rebounds, 10.5 assists. Unsurprisingly, he is the first player ever to average a 35-point triple-double over a 25-game stretch in NBA history. The 14th time this season, he had 25-plus points in a first half. He passed James Harden, who did it 2 years in a row in 19 and 20, for the most 25-point first halves in 25 years. It's like it's historic. I want to get away from the MVP discussion for a second on this, because you both brought up great points on the coverages and what defenses are sort of willing to live with. And I think this is the key point in all of this with great players. When we analyze the game, and this comes up all the time with Jokic, it's like, should we double, right? Or should we just let him go jump hook, bully ball in the post? Like Kevin Durant the other night, I call him the game. I think he had 45 points against the Celtics. They only doubled him 7 times the entire game. And some of that was based on time and score. Some of that was based on lineup, who was on the court with him. Was it an all shooting lineup? Was there a player you could double? So like with all this stuff, the smartest coaches are not going into a game and saying, we're going to do this every single time. We're going to double Joel Embiid every single time, because you're going to then have to live with something else. And I think the smartest coaches, what they're doing in game right now is they're recognizing time, score, and situation with their coverages. And that is honestly, and this is where I think people don't quite understand how hard it is defensively in the NBA. They're asking the players to make those adjustments in real time. And there's obviously some prep and some film study on that. There's discussions around that, but you have to oscillate between different things throughout the game, and it comes back down to, against the best players, they are going to get theirs in some capacity. You have to decide in real time, not before the game. I'm saying in real time, what is the score? What is the time? What is the situation? What are we willing to live with right now? Right now. And that ultimately is the calculus against great players in the NBA right now. And this goes back to the Dame Giannis thing. You get to the playoffs, game to game, within the game, there's discussion points. Okay, on this pick and roll, on these dribble handoffs, what are we willing to live with? What's my personnel? Who is the guy that's chasing Damian Lillard? Who's the guy that's navigating these picks? Am I willing to live with Damian Lillard shooting 25 times and me relying on a rear view contest? Am I willing to live with the defense being back, Giannis not getting behind, not getting those pocket passes on a 4-on-3 opportunity? Am I willing to live with none of that and Damian Lillard? Or Damian Lillard just hit 9 threes. Do I change the calculus in this game? That is the hard part. These fucking guys are so good, and you have to make these decisions all the time. So going back to Luka, the switching stuff is fascinating to me. It's like, all right, we've blitzed him a ton, and he's averaging 34, 9, and 9. All right, let's mix up some stuff. Like that stuff is fascinating to me right now in the NBA.
I think it's so much fun. I'm glad you mentioned the time, situation, and score, because you have these things you can live with until these moments or these players decide and make the plays to where, oh, we really can't live with this. And now it becomes who's going to blink first. Is this true to our coverage? Is this true to what you're going to do? Oh, it is. We lost. Well,
yeah. I'm not going to name the coach or the team, but there was a game I called this year where it was like, we're going to mix it up. We're going to mix it up against Jokic. We're going to mix it up. And at some point I'm like, all right, there's 9 minutes left. He still has 7 or 8 assists. He's now got 29 points. And Denver's up 7 with 9 minutes to go. Maybe it's time to mix it up because you haven't mixed it up yet. And what you're willing to live with is not working, right? So it's a great point. It's like, when are you going to blink and be like, okay, all right, now it's time. I got to go. I got to do something different. I think the question, Nekias, because you're such a savant with this sort of stuff, diving in within a game. Both you guys are. Steve, of course, you've got an insane background literally in the film room. But like, I think what is interesting to me is the mixing it up portion in terms of keeping these guys off balance. Do you see any of that against the very best? And by that, I mean, it's very easy for, all right, you're going to cross match against Jokic and you're going to put the 5 against Aaron Gordon. And like the Philly game, I remember the Philly game, watching the Philly game, and they had Embiid off of Jokic, the one in Philly that they both played. And it was like, okay, after 3 possessions, I was like, okay, Jokic has figured this out. Like, you got to do something. You got to do something different. It's the best players. I feel like it's not like you can be like, all right, we're going to mix it up in the first, and then we're going to go to something different in the second. It's almost like you have to mix it up every possession just to keep them off balance because they're so smart. The best players are so smart that if you give them 3 or 4 straight possessions, it only takes 1 possession for them to figure out what you're doing. It's not like, oh, I've never seen this before. As soon as they see it, they're like, oh, I've seen this before. I actually know, I know how to beat this. I know the pattern. That's what's fascinating to me is is it possible for teams possession by possession to really communicate this stuff and do it in real time and not just say, all right, now we're going to double, or now we're going to be in drop, or now we're going to be in switch. It's like switch, drop, double switch. It's like, is that even possible? And as a player, I don't know the answer to that.
To that question and to the Luka discussion, this is why the games between the Mavericks and the Raptors are always appointment viewing for me and have been for like the last 2-3 years. Because if there's a particular matchup in which you get that dichotomy of we're going to ramp up the pressure, put 2 on the ball, we're going to switch this time, we're going to switch and double this time, we'll go drop this time. Like the Raptors have been the team that's most consistently kind of toggled through all of that. And they ultimately end up trending towards one of the more aggressive teams against Luka. Like Chicago's also up there in terms of how often they blitz him. But the Raptors games in particular, I think, are the ones where, okay, we are doing a little bit of everything. And we'll just do that on a possession-by-possession basis. If a different lineup comes in, we'll also do that. And I guess the through line there is that they just have a bunch of length. So even when they have their subs in, they can still kind of toggle between that thing and shrink the floor. And the Mavericks will have help points. They can afford to send that extra help off and afford that to Luka or whatever. But I think teams are certainly at least trying to get there on a possession-by-possession basis. As for the overall point, like, I don't know if you can get there because a guy like Luka is too good. A guy like Jokic is too good. Giannis, Shea, go on down the list. But the attempt is certainly being made. You kind of have to.
I think with the talent level of some of these top guys, you have to mix those coverages to keep them out of rhythm. I think it just it's more about timing for me if you're a defense. What are we doing to try and disrupt their rhythm? Are we mixing things up because of what they're doing? Like with Damian, we'll bring back to that. Can we mix in a switch every now and then just to see if they can get them off? And then the other part is in the playoffs, can we just defend it enough to where they pivot to something else? Like, I don't want to mention any names, but there's always the moments where people get hunted in the playoff series. And do you actually have to do well in those moments? Or you just have to do your job so they think, okay, we don't have to run that anymore. Let's go somewhere else. I get tripped up on that because at the same time, you have to just, some defenses are like, you know what? We're just going to pick our poison. This is what we're going to deal with. This is what you're getting. This is the offense or the shot that we're willing to give up. Nothing else though. And I feel like some of the top stars, while you're trying to mix your coverages, while you're trying to take them out of rhythm, you also just live with it. I go back to that Phoenix-Denver series where it's like, you know what? Here's drop. Have a blast. There's nothing else you're getting though. And how do stars balance that part of it?
Yeah. It's okay. You can name me. I was hunted. You can say my name. You're allowed to do that. Kind of like how JJ was hunted in the playoffs. You can do that. It's fine. It's fine. I don't take offense.
Can I ask one question?
Yes.
When you did show them recover well and they went away from it, what was your thought?
Thank fucking God. Thank God. Oh man. Certain teams, like I remember like the Boston series when I was in Philly. They like hunted me a lot. They would like post Marcus Smart. They were trying to get me switched on certain guys. And like to a degree, it certainly worked. And then in game 4, I like had one of my best defensive games of my career. Like I had steals, I had deflections, I drew 3 offensive fouls. Like I fucking battled. And then I go into game 5 and I'm like, maybe they'll go away from. Nope, they're not going to go away from it.
Do it again, bud.
Do it again. We're going to play the percentages here. All right, guys. Appreciate you. As always, we'll see you soon.